My name is Renata Holloway. I'm 43 years old, and the document that stole my childhood home was signed by my father while he had a breathing tube down his throat. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not because I need your sympathy. I've made my peace with most of this, I promise you that. But because when I tell you what Diane did, I need you to understand the timing wasn't accidental. The timing was the whole plan. My father, Gerald Holloway, was admitted to Piedmont Atlanta Hospital on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day of all things, after his second major cardiac event in 3 years. I got the call at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had just set a cup of coffee down on my kitchen counter and I watched it sit there, completely untouched, for the next 4 hours while I drove from Decatur to the hospital with my hands at 10 and 2, barely breathing, running through every prayer I'd ever have forgotten from childhood. He was alive when I got there, barely. He was in the cardiac ICU, sedated, intubated, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical patience of a ventilator. There were wires. There were numbers on screens I didn't understand. There was a nurse named Cecily who squeezed my arm and said, "He's fighting." And I held on to that like it was a rope over a canyon. Diane was already there. She was sitting in the small waiting area outside the ICU bay, not in the chair pulled close to his bed, not holding his hand, but sitting with her ankles crossed and her phone face up in her lap. And when she saw me come through the double doors, she stood up and gave me the kind of hug you give someone at a work function. Quick, performed. Her perfume was very strong. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to notice, but grief makes your senses do strange things. They say he's stable, she told me. Flat, informational. I nodded and walked past her to be with my father. Gerald Holloway was not a complicated man. He was a retired electrician from Macon, Georgia, who had calloused hands and kept butterscotch candies in every jacket pocket and cried exactly twice in front of me. My entire life, once when his mother died and once when I walked across the stage at Georgia State. He remarried when I was 26, 7 years after my mother Celeste passed. I didn't love Diane then, but I accepted her because my father's eyes went a little less hollow when she was in the room, and I figured that was enough. That was my first mistake, though I wouldn't understand that for another 17 years. The home I'm talking about, the one at the center of all of this, is a four-bedroom craftsman on Winship Drive in West Atlanta. My parents bought it in 1988 for $62,000. My mother planted gardenias along the left side of the porch because she read somewhere that they kept mosquitoes away. They didn't really, but she kept planting them every spring anyway, and after she died, my father kept planting them too. I used to sit on that porch as a teenager and do my homework in the humidity because the inside of the house felt too still after she was gone. That house smelled like cedar and old carpet in my entire childhood. I'm telling you this so you understand that what was taken from me wasn't a piece of real estate. It was the last place on earth where my mother still existed. I stayed at the hospital for 6 days. I slept in the waiting room on nights 2 and 4. I brought my father's reading glasses and his worn paperback copy of a Louis L'Amour novel because I read somewhere that familiar objects can help reach people even when they're sedated. The nurses thought I was sweet. Diane went home each night at 8 o'clock. On day 9, my father was moved out of the ICU into a step down unit. His doctors were cautiously optimistic. He was still heavily medicated, disoriented, exhausted, asking me once what year it was, and another time calling me Celeste, which broke me quietly in a way I didn't let him see. It was on day 11 that I noticed something shift in Diane. She started arriving earlier. She started having longer, quieter conversations with the floor nurses that stopped when I walked in. She brought a man I didn't recognize to visit my father one afternoon, introduced him only as a friend from church, and the two of them were in my father's room for 40 minutes while I sat outside eating a vending machine sandwich because Diane had said my father needed to rest and I should give him space. I gave him space because I trusted that we both wanted the same thing. That man was not from her church. I found that out later, much later. By then, the document had already been signed, notarized, and filed with the Fulton County Recorder's Office. My childhood home, the gardenias, the cedar smell, the porch where I grew up, the backyard where we scattered half of my mother's ashes on a cold January morning in 2003, had been transferred entirely and irrevocably into Diane's name alone. And my father, when I finally asked him about it 3 weeks later over sweet tea at his kitchen table, looked at me with eyes that were tired and confused and said, Renata, honey, I don't remember signing anything. To understand how Diane became the kind of woman who could do what she did, you have to understand what she walked into when she married my father. And to understand that, you have to understand my mother. Celeste Holloway, née Celeste Marie Okafor, was the daughter of a Nigerian immigrant father and a Black woman from Albany, Georgia, who made the best sweet potato pie in 3 counties and brooked absolutely no nonsense from anyone. My mother inherited both qualities equally. She was precise and warm and exacting in the way that only women who've had to fight for every single thing they own ever learn to be. She kept the household finances in a navy blue binder with color coded tabs. She taught me to read a lease agreement before I was 16. She told me once, in the kitchen on Winship Drive while she was pressing my Easter dress, that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was let someone else hold all the information. She died of ovarian cancer in November of 2001. She was 51 years old. She had been diagnosed 14 months earlier and spent those 14 months making sure my father and I would be okay. She updated the will. She met with their financial advisor. She organized every document in that navy blue binder and left a handwritten index on the inside cover so my father could find anything he needed. She was sick and she was dying, and she spent her last year mothering us from a hospital bed with the same calm competence she brought to everything. I was 22 when she died. I moved back to Winship Drive for 8 months afterward. Not because my father asked me to, but because I couldn't stand the thought of him eating cereal for dinner alone in that house. We watched a lot of baseball. He taught me how to fix a fuse box. I taught him how to use email. We got through it the way people get through things, slowly, imperfectly, together. He met Diane Pruitt at a church picnic in the spring of 2004. She was 53, recently widowed, with 2 adult sons, Marcus and Kevin, who lived in Charlotte and called on birthdays if she reminded them. She was attractive in a careful, deliberate way. She laughed at my father's jokes, which were not always easy to laugh at. She brought him peach cobbler. My father, who had been eating cereal for dinner on and off for 3 years, was a willing man. I will be honest with you, I tried. I had them over for dinner. I went to their house for holidays. I made conversation with Marcus and Kevin at the wedding, a small ceremony at the church in 2006, and I stood next to my father and I smiled because he looked happy, and I had decided that his happiness was worth the discomfort of sharing him. For years, that calculus held. For years, Diane was merely a woman I tolerated. A little cool, a little territorial about the house, a little too comfortable referring to Winship Drive as my home when it had been my mother's home first. But nothing that crossed a line I couldn't step back from. The shift started small, it always does. The first thing I noticed was the photographs. I came by for Sunday dinner in the fall of 2014, and the framed photo of my parents' wedding that had lived on the living room bookshelf for as long as I could remember was gone. In its place was a photo of Diane and my father from a cruise they'd taken to the Bahamas. I asked my father about it later, privately, and he said he thought it had just been moved to make space. I looked for it and found it in a closet shelf in the guest room, face down, behind a stack of old phone books. I put it back on the bookshelf the next week. It disappeared again by Thanksgiving. I told myself it was her house too. I told myself grief manifests in territory sometimes. I told myself a lot of things that kept the peace because my father was healthy and content, and I didn't want to be the daughter who made everything about a photograph. Then there was the matter of my mother's jewelry. My mother had a small collection, nothing extravagant but meaningful. A gold bracelet her father brought from Lagos. A pearl necklace she wore to every important occasion of her life, including my college graduation. My father had kept these things in the small wooden box on their bedroom dresser since 2001. I noticed the box was gone sometime around 2016. When I finally asked my father where it was, he got quiet and said Diane had thought it made more sense to keep it somewhere safe. I asked where. He said he wasn't sure. I didn't push. I should have pushed. But my father was 71 by then, and his blood pressure had been a concern for 2 years, and I had made a private decision that his peace of mind was worth more than my anger. That decision cost me more than I can fully account for. The closest thing I got to a warning, a real, undeniable warning, came in the winter of 2017 at my cousin Lavinia's birthday dinner at a restaurant in Buckhead. Diane had had 2 glasses of wine and was in an expansive mood. And at some point, the conversation turned to the neighborhood and how property values on Winship Drive had nearly tripled since 1988. And Diane laughed a little and said, Gerald always says he should have bought the whole block when he had the chance. And then she paused and she looked at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And she said, Of course, eventually all of that becomes simpler. I didn't know what she meant. I filed it away in that mental drawer where we put things that unsettle us but can't be named yet. I filed it and forgot it and went back to my salmon and my wine. 6 years later, sitting across from a probate attorney in a glass walled office in Midtown Atlanta, I would finally understand exactly what she meant. The quitclaim deed had been notarized on February 25th. My father had been admitted to the hospital on February 14th. He was moved out of the ICU on the 23rd, still heavily medicated, still intermittently confused, still asking nurses what day it was. 2 days after he left the ICU, Diane had him sign the house away. The man she brought to the hospital, the one she introduced as a friend from church, was a mobile notary named Stuart Greer. I found his name on the document. I found his notary seal. I found his registration number with the Georgia Secretary of State's office. I found everything, eventually. But first, I had to survive the moment I found out. I found out on a Tuesday. Not in some dramatic way, not with a phone call or a confrontation or a document slid across a table. I found out the way a lot of devastating things are discovered by accident while looking for something else entirely. It was the middle of March. My father had been home from the hospital for about 3 weeks and was recovering slowly but steadily, cardiac rehab on Tuesdays and Thursdays, blood thinners, a low sodium diet he was deeply unhappy about. I had been stopping by Winship Drive 2 or 3 times a week to check on him, bring groceries, sit with him on the porch when the weather allowed. Diane was cordial during these visits, in the way a hotel concierge is cordial, efficient, surface level, always slightly angled toward the door. That Tuesday, I stopped by unannounced because I had his prescription refill from the pharmacy and I knew he was running low. Diane's car wasn't in the driveway. My father answered the door in his robe and looked genuinely glad to see me, which broke my heart a little because he shouldn't have had to look glad. I should have just been there the way I used to be. We sat in the kitchen. I made him decaf. He told me about a cardinal that had been coming to the feeder in the backyard every morning and how he'd started leaving out extra seed. He was more like himself than he'd been since before the hospital. His color was better. His eyes were clearer. At some point, he asked me to get his reading glasses from the little drawer in the hallway console table, the one my mother had bought at an estate sale in Midtown and refinished herself in a pale sage green that had faded now to something closer to gray. I went to the drawer. The glasses weren't there. What was there, sitting on top of a folded gas bill and a takeout menu, was a document with the Fulton County Recorder's Office stamp in the upper right corner. I almost closed the drawer. I don't know what made me pick it up. Some instinct. Some small, persistent voice that sounded, if I'm being honest, a little like my mother. I read the first paragraph. Then I read it again. Then I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time, holding a piece of paper that had effectively erased my name from the only home I'd ever known. Quitclaim deed. Grantor, Gerald Winston Holloway. Grantee, Diane Ruth Holloway. Property, 1847 Winship Drive, Nest WX, Atlanta, Georgia. Consideration, $10 and other valuable consideration. $10. They had valued my mother's house, my mother's gardenias, my mother's whole careful life at $10 and a notary seal. I put the document back exactly as I found it. I went back to the kitchen. I set my father's decaf in front of him. I sat down across from him and I looked at his face, the face of a man who had taught me to ride a bike in that driveway, who had slow danced with my mother in that kitchen, who had held my hand in a parking garage when we got the call that her scans were bad. And I said as steadily as I could manage, Daddy, do you remember signing any paperwork while you were in the hospital? He looked up from his coffee. Paperwork? Any documents? Anything Diane might have brought for you to sign? He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't evasion. It's genuine searching. I don't know, baby. Those first couple weeks are pretty fuzzy. You know how the medication had me. He paused. Why? Is something wrong? No, I said. I'm just making sure everything's in order. I drove home. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 22 minutes. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. Not because I think crying would have been wrong, but because what I felt wasn't grief yet. It was something colder and more clarifying than grief. It was the specific feeling of finally understanding something you'd been refusing to see for a very long time. I called my best friend, Dominique, who is a paralegal in Sandy Springs and has the gift of being furious on your behalf without making you feel worse about it. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, and then she said, Renata, do not touch anything, do not say anything to Diane, and come over here right now. I went over there. Dominique pulled up the Fulton County property records online before I'd even taken my coat off. The deed had been recorded on March 3rd, meaning it had been filed and processed before my father was even fully off his cardiac medications. She printed it, she stapled it. She put it in a folder and labeled the folder in her neat paralegal handwriting and slid it across her kitchen table to me like she was handing me a weapon, which, as it turned out, she was. You need a probate and estate attorney, she said. Not next week, tomorrow. I went home that night and I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and I thought about every moment I had smoothed over, every discomfort I had swallowed, every time I had chosen my father's peace over my own clarity. I thought about the photographs. I thought about the jewelry box. I thought about Diane at Lavinia's birthday dinner. Eventually, all of that becomes simpler, and I felt the full weight of how long she had been planning this. 3 days later, I drove back to Winship Drive in the early afternoon, knowing Diane would be home from her book club by 2. I needed her to know that I knew. Not because I was ready to fight. I wasn't, not yet, but because I needed to see her face. I needed to know whether she would lie. She didn't even flinch. I stood in my mother's kitchen and I said, I saw the deed, Diane. She set down her book club tote bag on the counter my mother had tiled herself in 1995, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient. The way you look at a child who has discovered something you always knew they'd find eventually. Your father wanted to simplify the estate, she said. It's perfectly legal. He was on a ventilator 11 days before that was signed. He was in a step-down unit. He was lucid. He doesn't remember signing it. She picked up her tote bag. Renata, I understand you're upset, but this house has been my home for 18 years. Your father made a decision. I'd encourage you to respect it. She walked out of the kitchen. I heard her bedroom door close. Quietly, deliberately. Not a slam, which would have been an emotion. Just a click. The sound of someone who believes they have already won. I stood in that kitchen for another minute. I looked at the sage green console table visible through the doorway. I looked at the faded spot on the wall where my mother's wedding photo used to hang. I looked at the window above the sink where my mother used to stand watching the backyard while she washed dishes, and I thought about her. And I thought about what she told me about information and about who holds it. Then I picked up my purse. I walked to the front door. I let myself out, and I started making a list. The attorney's name was Phyllis Okonkwo. Dominique found her, said she'd seen her work on 2 estate disputes at the firm where she paralegaled, and that she was the kind of woman who read documents the way other people read faces. Precise, unimpressed by intimidation, and absolutely allergic to injustice dressed up in legal language. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, and when I walked in for my first consultation on a Thursday morning in late March, she was already reading a printed copy of the quitclaim deed that Dominique had emailed ahead. She didn't look up immediately when I sat down. She finished the paragraph she was reading, set the document down, and looked at me over her glasses. Tell me about his condition on February 25th, she said. No preamble. No small talk. I told her everything. The ventilator, the step-down unit, the medication, the confusion. The moment he called me Celeste, the way he'd asked what year it was, the 40 minutes Diane spent in his room with a man she called a friend from church. Phyllis listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, the legal standard we're working with here is called testamentary capacity, or in the case of a deed, grantor capacity. The question is whether your father had the cognitive ability to understand what he was signing at the moment he signed it. Based on what you're describing, we have a reasonable argument that he did not. She paused. The reasonable arguments don't win cases. Evidence wins cases. So here's what we need. She handed me a yellow legal pad and a pen, And for the next 40 minutes, she told me exactly what to find and how to find it. And I wrote down every word. I want to tell you something about the weeks that followed because I think people imagine that the revenge part of a story like this is satisfying in a cinematic way, that you feel powerful and certain and propelled forward by righteous anger. And there were moments of that. But mostly it was painstaking, quiet, methodical work that I did alone at my kitchen table after long days at my job as a hospital billing coordinator, with cold coffee and a legal pad and my mother's voice in my head reminding me that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is let someone else hold all the information. I was done letting someone else hold the information. The first thing I needed was my father's medical records from his hospitalization. As his daughter and one of his listed emergency contacts, I was able to request these through the hospital's medical records department. It took 11 days and a formal written request and a fee of $43. And when the envelope arrived, I sat down with it at my kitchen table like it was something sacred, which in a way it was. The records were dense: pages of nursing notes, physician assessments, medication logs, vital signs recorded every 4 hours. I'm a hospital billing coordinator. I have been reading medical records professionally for 16 years. I knew what I was looking at. On February 25th, the date on the notary seal, my father had been administered 3.5 milligrams of lorazepam at 7 a.m. for agitation. His nursing note from the 10 a.m. check described him as intermittently confused, oriented to person but not consistently to place or time. His physician's note from that afternoon referenced cognitive cloudiness consistent with post ICU syndrome, expected to resolve with time, oriented to person but not consistently to place or time. I photographed every relevant page. I created a folder, physical and digital, organized by date. I sent copies to Phyllis. She called me that evening and said, with the closest thing to warmth I'd heard from her, "This is very good, Renata." The second thing I needed was Stuart Greer, the mobile notary, the man from the hospital. I had his name from the deed and his notary registration number from the Georgia Secretary of State's public database. What I didn't have was any documentation of what he actually witnessed that day, whether my father had seemed lucid to him, whether Diane had been present in directing the process, whether he had any reservations he hadn't voiced. I didn't contact Stuart Greer directly. Phyllis advised against it, said anything I said to him could be characterized as witness tampering if the case went to litigation. Instead, she sent a formal letter of inquiry through her office. What came back 2 weeks later was more than we expected. Stuart Greer had kept notes. Mobile notaries are not legally required to keep detailed journals, but Stuart Greer had done so anyway, apparently as a personal practice he developed after a difficult situation earlier in his career. His notes from February 25th described a patient who was, in his words, visibly fatigued and slow to respond, and who had asked him twice what the document was for despite being told. His notes also included something Phyllis said was potentially significant. Diane had answered several of the notary's standard orientation questions on my father's behalf before Stuart could hear my father's own response. Stuart Greer, it turned out, had not felt entirely comfortable that day. He had notarized the document because the patient was technically responsive and the document was presented by the patient's spouse. But he had kept his notes. And when Phyllis's letter arrived, he called her office directly and said he was willing to speak with her. I did not allow myself to feel triumphant yet. Phyllis had told me early on, don't celebrate a piece of evidence, celebrate a case. The third piece came from a source I hadn't anticipated. My father's cardiologist was a measured, careful man named Dr. Amara Mensa, who had been treating my father for 3 years and who had, I discovered, written a detailed clinical note on February 24th, the day before the deed was signed, expressing concern about my father's cognitive state and recommending a formal capacity evaluation before any major decisions were made. That note existed in my father's records. That recommendation had been made, and no such evaluation had been conducted before the deed was signed the following day. I read that note 3 times. Then I called Dominique. She knew. I said, "Of course she knew," Dominique said. Diane had been at the hospital every day. She would have spoken with the nursing staff. She may well have been aware of Dr. Mensa's concern about my father's capacity, and she moved the following day anyway. Whether that was calculated or coincidental, I couldn't prove, but the timeline spoke its own language. Phyllis filed a petition to void the quitclaim deed in Fulton County Superior Court in the third week of April. The grounds were lack of graduate capacity and undue influence. We attached the medical records, Dr. Mensa's clinical note, and a signed statement from Stuart Greer. I did not tell my father what I was doing. Not yet. He was still recovering. His blood pressure was still being managed. And I was terrified, genuinely terrified that the stress of knowing would harm him before the case could reach any resolution. So I carried it alone with Dominique and Phyllis, and I went to Winship Drive on Sundays and sat on the porch with my father and watched him put seed in the cardinal feeder and talked about baseball and let him believe everything was fine. It was the hardest acting job of my life. Diane received the petition notice on a Wednesday. Phyllis told me she called the office within 2 hours, which told us everything we needed to know about her confidence level. Her own attorney, a man named Breckenridge, who had the energy of someone accustomed to making problems disappear quietly, contacted Phyllis that same afternoon. He opened with, "My client believes this matter can be resolved without the expense of litigation." Phyllis said, "My client believes your client filed a fraudulent deed against an incapacitated man. We'll see you in court." She called me right after and relayed the exchange almost word for word. When she got to her own line, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 6 weeks. But the moment I had been both dreading and moving toward, the moment my father would have to know, was now unavoidable. Court proceedings meant his name, his medical records, his dignity in front of a judge. He deserved to hear it from me before he heard it from anyone else. I drove to Winship Drive on a Saturday morning in early May. Diane's car was gone. She spent Saturday mornings at a women's Bible study, which struck me, given everything, as one of the more remarkable details of this entire story. My father was on the porch with his coffee and his Louis L'Amour novel when I pulled up. He raised his cup at me. I got out of the car with a folder under my arm and walked up the porch steps and sat down in the chair next to him. He looked at the folder. He looked at my face. "Tell me," he said. So I told him. My father did not speak for a long time after I finished. He sat with his coffee cup held in both hands the way he always held it, thumbs hooked around the handle, the cup resting against his chest like something he was keeping warm. The cardinal came to the feeder while I was talking and he watched it without really seeing it. And when I placed the last document on top of the folder and slid it across the small porch table toward him, he looked at it for a moment and then looked away, out toward Winship Drive, where the Saturday morning was going about its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the thing being dismantled on this particular porch. "I don't remember signing it," he said finally. The same words he'd said in the kitchen 2 months earlier, but carrying different weight now. Now they weren't confusion, they were confirmation. "I know, Daddy. She was there every day," he said. Not as a defense of Diane, as a man reconstructing something he thought he understood. "I thought she was there because she was scared of losing me. I didn't say anything to that. There was nothing I could add to it that wouldn't make it worse. And he was 76 years old and had a healing heart, and I was not going to be the person who told him what that sentence cost him to say." He picked up the deed. He read it slowly. My father reads everything slowly and completely, always has, which is why what Diane did required him to be medicated and disoriented. Under normal circumstances, Gerald Holloway would have read every line of that document and asked questions about every word he didn't recognize. When he finished, he set it down and said, "What do you need from me?" I told him a formal statement about his condition during his hospitalization, his cooperation with Dr. Mensa, who had agreed to provide expert testimony regarding grandeur capacity, his willingness to sit for a deposition if necessary. He nodded at each item like he was taking a work order. "And Renata," he said when I finished. "Yes, sir. I want to call Phyllis myself today." He did. From the porch, while I sat next to him and looked at my mother's gardenias, which were beginning their spring growth along the left side of the porch railing, pale green and persistent and entirely unbothered by everything that had tried to displace them. The hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday of July. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened, because this is the part of the story where people expect drama, raised voices, tears in the gallery, a villain finally crumbling under the weight of her own cruelty. But that is not quite what happened. What happened was both quieter and more complete than that. Diane arrived with Breckenridge in a charcoal blazer and the same careful, deliberate composure she had carried into every room for 18 years. She did not look at me when she entered. She looked at the room the way someone looks at a problem they are confident they can manage. My father sat beside me at the petitioner's table. He was in the Navy suit he wore to my college graduation, which still fit him, which made me love him so much I had to look at the table for a moment. Phyllis sat on his other side with her reading glasses on and a legal pad that was already half filled with her precise handwriting. Breckenridge opened by arguing that the deed was a legitimate estate planning decision made by a competent adult in consultation with his spouse, and that the petitioners were attempting to override a legal instrument on the basis of unsubstantiated claims about mental capacity. He was polished, he was practiced, he used the phrase, the loving intentions of a devoted wife, without any visible discomfort. Phyllis waited. When it was her turn, she did not raise her voice once. She walked the court through the medical timeline with the patience and precision of someone who has done this before and knows that clarity is more devastating than passion. February 14th, admission. February 23rd, transfer out of ICU. February 24th, Dr. Mensa's clinical note recommending capacity evaluation before major decisions. February 25th, deed signed, no capacity evaluation conducted. She introduced Dr. Mensa's written testimony, which described in clinical language the specific cognitive effects of the medications my father had been administered and the documented disorientation noted in his nursing records on the date in question. Dr. Mensa had written, with the careful precision of someone who understands that his words carry legal weight. In my professional opinion, Mr. Holloway's condition on February 25th was inconsistent with the capacity required to execute a major property transfer with full understanding of its implications. Then Phyllis called Stuart Greer. He was a slight man in his early 60s with the manner of someone who had spent decades being invisible in rooms where important things happened, notarizing signatures, witnessing documents, observing moments that other people considered private. He sat in the witness chair and answered Phyllis's questions in a quiet, careful voice. He described arriving at the hospital. He described my father's appearance. Fatigued, slow to respond. He described asking the standard orientation questions and described Diane answering two of them before my father could respond. He read from his own handwritten notes, the notes he had kept in a small spiral journal he produced from his jacket pocket and which were entered into evidence, and his voice did not waver once. Breckenridge cross-examined him with some aggression, suggesting that Stewart's notes were self-serving and his recollection unreliable. Stewart looked at him calmly and said, "I've been a mobile notary for 21 years. I keep notes on every appointment. That is my practice. Those notes were written on the day of the appointment. I have nothing to gain from being here." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Diane testified. She was composed, precise, and entirely consistent in her account. Gerald had understood what he was signing, had asked to simplify their estate planning, had been fully present and willing. She answered every question with the practiced reasonableness of someone who had rehearsed. But Phyllis had one question she had been saving. "Mrs. Holloway, you were present when Dr. Mensa spoke with hospital staff on February 24th, the day before the deed was signed. Is that correct?" A pause. "I may have been nearby, yes. Were you aware of Dr. Mensa's recommendation that a formal capacity evaluation be conducted before your husband made any major decisions?" Another pause. Longer. "I don't recall that specifically." Phyllis looked at her for exactly one moment. Then she said no further questions and sat down. I have thought about that pause many times since. That pause was not confusion. That pause was a woman calculating the distance between what she knew and what could be proven. And in that gap, that small, human, revealing gap, was everything. The judge issued her ruling 4 weeks later in a written decision I read at my kitchen table on a Wednesday morning before work. The quitclaim deed was voided. The grounds cited were lack of adequate grantor capacity at the time of execution and the presence of circumstances consistent with undue influence. The property at 1847 Winship Drive, Nowes, was to be returned to its prior ownership status. The judge further noted that the timeline of events, specifically the execution of the deed in the immediate aftermath of a major cardiac event and in apparent disregard of a treating physician's documented recommendation, raised concerns that she referred to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for review. I sat with that document for a long time. Then I called my father. He answered on the second ring. I told him. He was quiet, and then he made a sound I had not heard from him since my mother's funeral, a sound that was not quite crying but lived in the same neighborhood. I told him I loved him. He said, "Your mother would have had that deed figured out in 48 hours. I know, I said. I had to work up to her speed. He laughed. It was the best sound I'd heard in months. Diane moved out of Winship Drive in September. I helped my father replant the gardenias that fall, 3 new plants along the porch railing to replace 2 that hadn't survived the summer. He held the trowel and I held the root ball, and we pressed them into the soil together in the early October air. And he told me about my mother buying that first flat of gardenias from a nursery in College Park and how she'd read about mosquitoes and been so certain and been so wrong and kept planting them anyway, every single spring because she liked the way they smelled. Stubborn woman, he said, with all the love in the world. I know where I get it, I said. Before I go, I want to say something to anyone watching this who has ever smoothed something over to keep the peace, who has swallowed a discomfort to protect someone else's comfort, who has looked at an early warning sign and filed it away in that mental drawer because naming it felt like more trouble than burying it. I understand that instinct completely. I lived inside it for 17 years. But here's what I learned on Winship Drive, in a courtroom on Peachtree Street, and on a porch in October with my hands in the dirt beside my father's. The people who count on your silence are counting on it. Your restraint is not invisible to them. It is load bearing, it is structural. They have built their plans around the certainty of it. And the most dangerous thing you can do for them, and the most necessary thing you can do for yourself, is to finally, quietly, completely stop being what they were counting on you to be. Take the folder, make the list, call the attorney, and plant the gardenias anyway. Before I go, if you made it to the end of this story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And has anyone in your life ever counted on your silence a little too comfortably? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one.